Abraham, a key figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham is often referred to as the father of a multitude and is known for his deep relationship with God, a relationship that sets the stage for God's connection with humanity. So, let's rewind back to around the 20th century BCE. Abraham, originally named Abram, was born near the city of Gerar in Mesopotamia, which is in modern-day southern Iraq. He was married to his half-sister Sarah, originally Sarai, and together they embarked on a life-changing journey. This journey took them from Mesopotamia to Haran, and eventually to Canaan in Egypt. Now, when Abraham was 75 years old, something incredible happened. He received a calling from God. God promised to make him into a great nation and bless him immensely. Despite the risks, especially considering his age, Abraham trusted God and set off with his family, including his father Terah and his nephew Lot, to find this promised land. Their journey took them first to Haran, where his father Terah passed away at the age of 205. Then Abraham and his caravan entered Canaan. Here, God appeared to Abraham, promising that this land would belong to his descendants. To show his gratitude and worship, Abraham built an altar to God and continued his journey, eventually settling near the Negev, southwest of the Dead Sea. But life wasn't all smooth sailing. A severe famine hit Canaan, forcing Abraham and his family to seek refuge in Egypt. However, this move brought its own set of challenges. Fearing for his life because of Sarah's beauty, Abraham asked her to pose as his sister, a half-truth since she was indeed his half-sister. As expected, Pharaoh's officials noticed Sarah's beauty and took her to Pharaoh's palace. Abraham, in turn, was showered with gifts, including cattle and servants. But God wasn't pleased with this situation, and soon Pharaoh and his household were struck by terrible plagues. Realizing the truth, Pharaoh confronted Abraham and, despite being deceived, allowed him to leave Egypt with all his possessions. After returning to Canaan, Abraham's tribe continued to thrive, becoming so prosperous that it led to conflicts over resources between Abraham's and Lot's herders. The tension grew so intense that they eventually decided to part ways. Abraham settled in the plain of Hebron, while Lot chose the plain of Sodom, a decision that would later have dire consequences. And now, one of the most heart-wrenching parts of Abraham and Sarah's story is their struggle with infertility. Back in those days, having children wasn't just about growing a family, it was crucial for survival and social standing. Being childless was seen as a huge shame, especially for women. People often thought it was some sort of punishment for hidden sins. Plus, children were viewed as blessings, a form of security, ensuring that someone would take care of you in your old age. So it's no wonder that Abraham was deeply troubled by the fact that he and Sarah couldn't have kids. In Genesis 15, we see him pouring out his frustration to God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" Basically, Abraham is saying, "Look, God, you've given me all these promises, but I don't even have a child to carry on my legacy." But God, in that special way he had with Abraham, reassured him, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." And despite everything, Abraham believed God, and this faith was credited to him as righteousness. However, Sarah was running out of patience. She was desperate for a child, and in her frustration, she came up with a plan. She told Abraham to have a child with their Egyptian slave, Hagar, and that this child would be considered Sarah's own. Now, this might sound shocking today, but back then it wasn't that unusual. Slaves had little to no rights, and this kind of arrangement could even offer some security to the slave. But as you might guess, things got messy. Hagar did become pregnant, and the tension between her and Sarah skyrocketed. They ended up resenting each other deeply. Hagar felt proud and superior, while Sarah was hurt and jealous. The situation got so bad that Hagar decided to run away. She fled into the desert, which was extremely dangerous. But this is where something truly remarkable happened. According to the Bible, God sent an angel to find Hagar and bring her back. The angel told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." This is a powerful moment because, despite Hagar's lowly status as a slave, God saw her, cared for her, and promised her a future. Hagar even gave God a name, El-Roi, meaning, the God who sees me. Hagar returned and eventually gave birth to a son, whom Abraham named Ishmael. Though Ishmael would go on to become the father of many nations, his life, as described in the Bible, was filled with conflict. He is portrayed as a wild, untamed man, constantly at odds with those around him. Years later, God renewed his covenant with Abraham, asking him to walk faithfully and promising to greatly increase his descendants. This time, there was a new requirement, circumcision. God told Abraham that every male in his household, including slaves and foreigners, had to be circumcised as a sign of this covenant. Even though Abraham and Sarah were now nearly 100 years old, God promised them a son of their own. And when Abraham heard this, he couldn't help but laugh at the sheer impossibility of it all. Sarah laughed too when she heard the news. But God reassured them, saying, "My covenant will be with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." And so, obedient as always, Abraham circumcised Ishmael and every male in his household, including himself, at the ripe old age of 99. This act of devotion was not just a ritual, it was a deep expression of his faith and commitment to God. It's a tradition that has been passed down through generations, even to this day. And even after all the promises God made to him, Abraham still struggled with fear and uncertainty. One of these moments occurred when Abraham and his household traveled to the region of Gerar. Old fears resurfaced, especially concerning the beauty of his wife Sarah. Abraham worried that someone might kill him to take her, and this fear led him to repeat a familiar mistake. Just like in Egypt, Abraham told everyone that Sarah was his sister, this time catching the attention of Abimelech, the king of Gerar. The Bible tells us that Abimelech took Sarah into his household, not knowing she was Abraham's wife. But God stepped in before things could go too far. In a troubling dream, God warned Abimelech not to touch Sarah. The king, bewildered, pleaded with God, insisting that he hadn't known the truth, and God acknowledged that. God told Abimelech, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me." Then he instructed Abimelech to return Sarah to Abraham, explaining that Abraham was a prophet who would pray for him. When Abimelech confronted Abraham, he was understandably upset. He demanded to know why Abraham had deceived him. Abraham admitted that he was afraid for his life because of Sarah's beauty, but in an act of generosity, or perhaps out of fear of further divine consequences, Abimelech not only returned Sarah but also gave Abraham gifts of sheep, cattle, and servants, and offered him the choice to settle anywhere in his land. Abraham, in turn, prayed for Abimelech and his household, and the curse of childlessness that had fallen upon them was lifted. Despite Abraham's flaws and fears, God's promise to him still stood strong. And finally, the moment that Abraham and Sarah had waited for so long arrived. Sarah became pregnant, and Isaac was born. His name, meaning laughter, was a reminder of how both Abraham and Sarah had laughed at the thought of having a child in their old age. But here he was, their miracle child, and Abraham, now 100 years old, fulfilled God's command by circumcising Isaac as part of their covenant. However, the arrival of Isaac stirred up old tensions in the household. Sarah saw Hagar and Ishmael as a threat to Isaac's inheritance and demanded that Abraham send them away. This deeply troubled Abraham because Ishmael was still his son, but God reassured him, promising that Ishmael would also become the father of a great nation. So, with a heavy heart, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael into the desert. Once again, they found themselves in a desperate situation, but God didn't abandon them. An angel appeared to Hagar, comforting her and providing a well of water to save them from thirst. Ishmael grew up in the desert, became an expert archer, and indeed his descendants would go on to form a great nation. But the most challenging test for Abraham was still to come. God asked him to do the unimaginable, sacrifice his son, Isaac. The Bible doesn't record any argument from Abraham, but it's hard to imagine the turmoil he must have felt. Yet Abraham obeyed, setting out with Isaac and 2 servants to the place God had designated. Along the way, Isaac, unaware of what was about to happen, asked his father, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham replied, "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." Many see this as a foreshadowing of a later sacrifice that would come in Christian theology. When they reached the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar, tied up Isaac, and raised the knife. But just as he was about to go through with it, an angel called out to stop him. Abraham had proven his faith and obedience, and God provided a ram to sacrifice instead. The angel declared that because Abraham had not withheld his son, God would bless him abundantly, making his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. As Abraham's life story began to draw to a close, we see the death of Sarah at the age of 127. She was buried in the cave of Machpelah, a site Abraham purchased, which would later become the resting place for many of their descendants. After Sarah's death, Abraham married again, this time to a woman named Keturah, with whom he had 6 more children. But Isaac remained his primary heir, the child of the promise. When Abraham died at the age of 175, Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury their father, reuniting one last time in an act of family unity. As we look back at Abraham's life, it's clear that while there may not be much direct archaeological evidence to prove his existence, his story has left a profound impact on history and faith. Various archaeological discoveries have hinted at the world he would have known, from cities in Mesopotamia to ancient texts that mirror his story. The journey of Abraham continues to resonate, not just as a tale of faith, but as a reminder of the complexities and challenges that come with trusting in something greater than ourselves.